All right. Well, good to see everybody today, and greetings to everybody that's on the webcast. It's kind of strange for me to be looking at a camera so close to my face, but I hope that I'll come across okay to everybody out there and to the people that are here. Today I want to go through a story that we find in the Old Testament. It's something I come across every year because usually what I do is after the Feast of Tabernacles, I begin reading the book of Genesis. And I read through until at the Feast of Tabernacles the next year, I'm in the book of Deuteronomy. So right about this time of year, actually, it's kind of strange that this worked out, that the readings that are being read currently are out of the book of Genesis, and they're about the story of a man named Joseph. And Joseph is a man that I consider him, from the many times I've read through Genesis, as what I call a VIP of the Old Testament because of all the material that's dedicated to this young man and this patriarch of the nation of Israel. I'm always amazed at this story because you have a young man who is a little bit naive when he's young, who goes from the favored son of a chieftain into a pit, then becomes a slave, thrown in jail, and then he becomes the second in command of the greatest nation that existed at that time. So today I want to go through some examples, some scriptures from the story of Joseph, and I hope that it'll bring out maybe some things you may not have considered before about him, and maybe generate some excitement to go and maybe do more research into his life. So let's start and look at his family background a little bit. So if we'll go to Genesis 30. Genesis 30, and I apologize, I've got the scriptures here on my device, and so I'll try not to be too tied to this device, but I'll be reading the scriptures off of here. I'll try to give you time to turn. We're going to Genesis 30 and starting in verse 22. Genesis 30 and verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. So the background here is we have Jacob, who's married to Leah and Rachel, and many of you probably remember the story behind that. Rachel was the woman he really loved, and Leah was the woman that Laban kind of got to him, gave him in the middle of the night, and he ended up having two wives instead of one at the end of a couple weeks there. So Rachel had been waiting 14 long years to have a son. It was a point of contention between her and Leah because back then one of the most important things to them was to continue the family line. And if you could not have children, you were looked upon negatively. So Rachel went through a lot of emotional trauma and stress because of the fact that she could not have children. The only way that she had actually given Jacob any children up to the point where she had Joseph was through her maid, Bilhah. And so we see the example that both Leah and Rachel gave Jacob their maids, and from those maids came several of the tribes of Israel. Note that this was while Jacob was still working for his uncle Laban. So it was ended the 14 years he had worked for Rachel and Leah. So he goes and he says, I'll work for you for 7 years for Rachel, right? And then he ends up with Leah. And so Laban says, look, just work for me another 7 years and I'll give you Rachel right now. So anyway, he gets into a 14-year arrangement with his uncle Laban to take care of his flocks. So he's been doing this for quite a while. He wanted to leave and go back home. He was ready to leave and get out on his own, get out from under Uncle Laban. But Uncle Laban makes him an offer he can't refuse. Please stay and take care of my flocks, and you can tell me what you want to be paid. Just name your price. Because he saw that God was blessing him with the work that Jacob was doing for him. So Jacob knew his uncle pretty well by this time. And he said, I want something that cannot be disputed. I want a wage that you cannot dispute. So he said, give me the spotted, the speckled, and the brown animals from your flock as my wages. That's what I want. And back then, they probably didn't like those kind of animals. They wanted the white fur. They wanted the more pure animals. So he says, give me something that most people don't want. And he served Laban another 6 years in this manner. And God revealed to Jacob, and it says that God sent him a dream and said, this is how you will grow your flocks. And the idea that he got to put these peeled sticks and these speckled sticks up in front of the sheep while they were mating was something God told him in a dream. And in verse 43, it says he became exceedingly prosperous. So let's look at how Jacob himself describes these last 6 years to Laban. And I'm just trying to build some background to the life of Joseph for you. Jacob is told in a dream to go back home. God comes and said, it's time for you to head back home. His relationship has begun to be strained with Laban because Laban sees, look at the flocks of this guy. Look at how many flocks and animals he has. So Jacob decides, I'm not going to get a good departure from this guy, so let's just pack up and leave. So he packs up and leaves, and Laban chases after him and catches up to him. Let's go to Genesis 31. Genesis 31, and we'll read verse 38. Here's how Jacob describes how he was treated by his uncle Laban. In verse 38, Jacob is speaking, and he says, these 20 years, so 20 years now, I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried their young, and I have not eaten the rams of your flock. That which was torn by beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it. You required it from my hand, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was. In the day the drought consumed me, the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. Thus I have been in your house 20 years. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock. And you have changed my wages 10 times. Unless the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked you last night. They're referring to a dream that Laban had had the night before, warning him not to harm Jacob. So Jacob had had his wages changed 10 times because Laban kept trying to figure out, how can I get more out of this deal? How can I get more out of Jacob than what I'm giving him? So he's working for 6 years while his father watched his flocks just continue to grow and grow and grow. And this was the wage that he had agreed to with Jacob. So Jacob leaves, they separate, and he takes up residence in Succoth, it says, which was situated in the valley on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So he's coming back from the other side of the Jordan, north of the Jordan, and he comes back and he settles in this area because it's good for pasture. He builds a house and shelters for his livestock. He picks up and moves 20 miles to the west. It says, in crossing the Jordan River, and buys a piece of land near the city of Shechem. So we're not told how much time has gone by, but it's safe to assume that Joseph was still pretty young when his sister Dinah was raped by Shechem, the son of Hamor. He might have witnessed as a young boy what happened to the city of Shechem and been around the women and children that were taken captive by his brothers. And that story, if you want to go read it, you can go find it, where you remember the son of Shechem wanted to marry, or the son of Hamor wanted to marry Dinah, and they told him, sure, we will do this as long as all of your men become circumcised. And they agreed to it, and on the third day, Simeon and Levi went into the city and killed all the men. And so then they took captive all the women and children. So suddenly you have an influx into the tribe of Jacob, a whole city, perhaps, not a very large city, but maybe 30 to 40 people suddenly were part of their tribe now. So Jacob, again, we're told, picks up his family and moves to Bethel, 20 miles to the south, probably trying to get away from Shechem. It says, he was afraid of what might happen to them because of what they had done. And it actually says in there that God put fear onto the inhabitants of the land around there to kind of just keep them from going after Jacob. So he eventually goes, as I said, he moves to Bethel, and then he goes further south to Hebron, and he's living near his father Isaac. So much of Joseph's early life is spent in a nomadic lifestyle. He's not really in one city his whole life. He's been moving from one place to another as he's growing up. The next time we see Joseph, he is 17 years old and living in a less than ideal family situation. Joseph has become the favorite son among 12 brothers. And as the account tells us, he was the son of Jacob's old age. And the fact that he was the son of Rachel, his favorite wife, was probably a pretty big factor in it as well, of why he loved Joseph so much. Let's go to Genesis 37 now and pick up the story. Genesis 37, and starting in verse 2, Genesis 37 and verse 2, this is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. So these are the sons of the handmaiden. So I think it was Gad and Asher and Naphtali, and I can't remember the fourth one, but it was 4 brothers that were the sons of the handmaidens. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel, verse 3, loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Sounds like a very unpleasant atmosphere, doesn't it? Have you ever been given the silent treatment by your significant other, your wife or husband, or maybe your brother or sister when you were growing up? They got so mad at you that they would refuse to talk to you until after a while they finally forgot about what had happened and everything went back to normal. But it says here, the Hebrew word for hated in this verse 4 is S-A-N-E is the spelling. I think it's pronounced sane. And it means to hate personally, an enemy, a foe, hate utterly. So the word is very strong of how his brothers looked at him. They could barely stand to be around him. We are not told whether Jacob noticed this, but it is hard to imagine how he could have missed this fact, that the brothers were so against Joseph and just did not want to be around him. But we're not told that he took any action. So he must not have thought it was that big of a problem. Now in verse 5 of this same chapter, verse 5, Joseph had a dream and he told it to his brothers. Here is where he, in his naivety, I believe, he just did not really understand how badly he was affecting his relationship with his family. And he said, please hear this dream that I've dreamed. And he says, there we were binding sheaves in the field, and all the other sheaves came and bowed down to me, which is basically saying, you're all going to bow down to me. And then later on he dreamed and said, the sun and moon and the 11 stars bowed down to me, which is the sun and moon was his father and mother. So he's telling them this dream, and his father actually rebukes him. It says in verse 10, it says, what is this dream? Shall your mother and I and your brothers come and bow down to you? I mean, you're the 10th or 11th son? I don't know actually the order, but he's not the firstborn son of the family. So it says the brothers in verse 11 envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now, sometime later, we're not told how long, Jacob sends Joseph. And I think this is an indication that Jacob, it seems, didn't have a clue of what was going on with the brothers and Joseph. Because Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers and the flocks in Shechem. So here they are, they're in Hebron. And he says, go check on your brothers and see how it's going with them. Now Shechem is 50 miles to the north. Here we see another indication. As I said, Joseph, may have been a little naive, and Jacob was definitely not aware of what was happening. But we learned something about Joseph. Here's a perhaps 17, 18-year-old young man, and he obviously knew how to handle himself well enough that Jacob tells him, saddle up and travel 50 miles overland to check on your brothers up in Shechem. So apparently he knew how to handle himself out in the wilderness, and he knew how to travel. So he was probably on a donkey, going through the hill country, because it's hilly country between Hebron and Shechem. We also learn that it was Joseph's nature to trust other people. Maybe he was just a little too trusting. If he had not trusted his brother's intentions toward him, he probably would have taken some people with him, don't you think? If he would have thought, Dad's sending me out here and I'm going to be all alone with these brothers that hate me. Maybe I ought to take Joe and Bob over here with me, just as, backup in case something happens. Apparently he didn't do that. He just went off by himself. So he gets up there and he finds out they've moved 15 miles down the road to Dothan. And he goes to find them, and we see the continuation of this story in verse 18 of Genesis 37, verse 18. It says, they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, and they conspired to kill him. Then they said to one another, look, this dreamer is coming. They call him the dreamer. He's coming to check on us again. And, 4 of them had already had a bad report to their father, so they probably figured this is not going to be good. So they say in verse 20, come therefore, let us now kill him and cast him in some pit. And we shall say, a wild beast has devoured him. So they'd already thought about this. And here's the story that they later told to Jacob. We shall see what will become of his dreams. Now we see the depth of their hatred. Here his own family, his brothers are wanting to kill him. And they had thought about it. They had thought about it. It wasn't just a sudden idea. They had thought about this, and they already had their alibi ready to go. Verse 21, Reuben heard it and delivered him out of their hands, saying, let us not kill him. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness. Do not lay a hand on him. And he was going to save him. He was going to come back and deliver him and take him home. So it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers, they stripped him of his tunic, put him in the pit, and then they sat down to eat. So Joseph's in the pit, and we find out later on that he was screaming and crying and begging them to take him out of the pit. They ignored him. And apparently Reuben had gone off. He had to go off somewhere maybe and do something with the herds. So the brothers, some of them are eating the meal, and they see this caravan of Ishmaelites coming by. And they say, let's not kill him. Let's let other people kill him. So Judah says, let's sell him. Let's just, we don't want to be guilty for killing him. We'll sell him to these traders as a slave, and that'll be a death sentence, just so other people can do it, not us. So they go ahead and sell him for 20 shekels of silver. And Joseph ends up in Egypt. So he's gone from the most favored son of a chieftain, of a clan. Now he's a slave, and he's down in Egypt. He's being put up on the slave market. The Believer's Bible Commentary points out, and I wanted to bring this point out, and you find this for almost all of the major characters in the Old Testament, is there is a type of Jesus Christ. There is a type in the characters that we read about in the Old Testament that points us to traits and characteristics of Christ. The Believer's Bible Commentary says this about Joseph. It says, Joseph, quoting, is one of the most beautiful types of the Lord Jesus Christ in the Old Testament, though the Bible never labels him as a type. One author lists 101 correspondences between Joseph and Jesus, and another lists 121. For example, Joseph was loved by his father. He rebuked the sin of his brothers, and he was hated by his brothers and sold into the hands of his enemies. He was punished unjustly. He was exalted and became the Savior of the world at that time, for all the world had to come to him for bread. And you can see all the various types there toward Jesus Christ, who was also loved by his father, who was hated by his own people, and betrayed into the hands of foreigners. He goes from these riches, as I said, now he's a slave in Potiphar's household. Imagine what Joseph was thinking at this point. What did I do to deserve this? I've been a pretty good kid, well taken care of, maybe a little pampered, but here he is, he's a slave, and his family doesn't know anything about him. His dad doesn't know anything about him. He could have gotten very discouraged and said, God has just forgotten about me. Yet the depth of his faith and integrity did not falter in the new circumstance he found himself in. He becomes established in Potiphar's household. And Potiphar sees that he's blessed because of Joseph and puts almost everything under his control. He becomes, as they say, a steward of the house. And so that he pretty much controlled everything that happened except for the food that Potiphar ate. Then a test of his faith is thrown at him. Genesis 39. Genesis 39 and verse 4. Genesis 39 and verse 4. It says, Joseph found favor in his sight, in Potiphar's sight, and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from the time that he made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And it came to pass after these things, his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph and said, Lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, Look, my master does not even know what is with me in the house. He has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you. Because you are his wife, how can I then do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph passes the test with flying colors. Notice, despite years of slavery, despite the stress that he was under, his faith in God was strong. He refuses to be compromised by his master's wife, to the point where he even avoided her presence. We know the rest of the story here. Instead of being rewarded for doing the right thing, Joseph is falsely accused and thrown into prison by Potiphar. He goes from being the manager of Potiphar's household, which probably was a pretty good job, pretty good position, to the dungeons. At this point, we would all probably be wondering what we had done to deserve such a fate. God, I did it right. I didn't sin. Why am I being punished? Why am I in prison? Can you imagine how we would feel? Yet we hear no complaints. There's no complaints recorded of Joseph. He was a living example of what Peter would later write in 1 Peter 3, verse 14. 1 Peter 3 and verse 14 says, But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. And dropping down to verse 17, it says, For it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. We don't know exactly when Joseph was put into prison, but we do know that a significant event happened in his 28th year. Pharaoh becomes angry with two officials at his court and throws them into jail, the cupbearer and the chief baker. So at this point, Joseph has also grown in trust with the administrator of the prison, and he's put in charge of these two very important prisoners. He's told, okay, you're going to take care of these guys and make sure they're comfortable. So he finds out that they both have had dreams. And it happened that the dreams were 3 days before the Pharaoh's birthday. And the Pharaoh had made a decision. We don't know if he decided 3 days before, if he had already decided it or waited till his birthday, but he decides he's going to execute one of the men and bring the other one back to his old job. Notice what Joseph says to the butler after he interprets his dream, which is the butler was the guy that was going to get his job back. He says in Genesis 40 and verse 14, Genesis 40 verse 14, he tells the butler, Remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. He doesn't complain about his plight, but he does not want to remain in jail. And notice here, he doesn't throw his family under the bus here. He just basically says, he could have said, my brothers betrayed me and sent me down here, sold me into slavery. He doesn't tell them that. He says, I've been stolen away and brought down here, which was probably a good thing he didn't tell them that, because how would he go to Pharaoh later on and say, hey, can my family come down and live in Egypt? And Pharaoh would say, well, you mean those brothers that were so mean to you, and tried to kill you? You want them to come down here? Are you kidding me? So Joseph didn't throw his family under the bus. There's a lesson there. But it says the butler promptly forgot Joseph, and he remained in prison another 2 years, 2 more years. We know Joseph was brought out of prison at age 30. We were told that he was 30 years old. Some might say his best years were spent as a slave and a prisoner. Think about it. His youngest years, in his prime, he was a slave and he was a prisoner in jail. But had his faith or integrity been diminished by these experiences? Let's find out. Let's go to Genesis 41. Genesis 41 and verse 15. This is after the Pharaoh has the dream, and he brings Joseph in and says, I've heard that you know how to interpret dreams. And verse 15, Pharaoh says, I've had a dream and there's no one who can interpret it, but I've heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Notice that Joseph points Pharaoh to God as the one who will give the dream's interpretation. His faith in God was as strong as ever. He didn't try to puff himself up in the sight of Pharaoh. He said, God will tell us the answer to this. In verse 25, Joseph says to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. So God showed Pharaoh through this dream what was coming. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint officers and let them collect food. And so Joseph basically gives Pharaoh a 14-year plan. Right? He says, we're getting 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So here's a 14-year plan. Joseph is saying, God is showing you what's going to happen. And he gives him a plan of how to handle it. Store up the food during the good years and you'll have it when you need it in the bad years. But notice Joseph, he didn't step forward and say, well, hey, I told you the meaning of the dream, so obviously I'm the guy. I'm your man. Pick me. I can be the administrator. No, he stood by, and after he gave the interpretation, he waited to see the response. Now we see another test for Joseph. Another test for Joseph. He's appointed to be pretty much the prime minister of Egypt, second in command. Nothing happens in Egypt unless Joseph approves it. Now he's in a position of power and wealth. He's in a position to get back at people now, right? You think that he went to Potiphar and said, hey, you're going to the dungeon, buddy. I found something you did wrong, and I dug up some bad transactions you did at the bank or whatever, and you're going to jail, and your wife's going to go to jail, or maybe we'll just execute her, right? None of that. We don't see any of that. He didn't get back at the chief butler. You think that would have been a little embarrassing with the butler and Joseph's there, and he's second in command now, and the butler's bringing him his wine, and, oh, you're the guy that I helped in prison. And, he never helped Joseph. But he didn't do that. He didn't get back at people. So he was tested in times of adversity and in times of prosperity. Think about that. Many people that are in positions of wealth and power, they don't think of that as a test, right? A lot of people don't see that as a test. They think, hey, life's going good. Everything's great. I've got plenty of money. I've got power. Is that a test? Well, in this case, I think it was a test for him. I've never been wealthy or powerful, and I kid around with my friends about having sprinkler heads in the front yard and garages to park their cars in, but I've never been at that level, and who knows, maybe one of these days I will be tested in that way. But today, we see Joseph was tested he was tested in both ways. He endured 13 years of adversity and maintained his integrity and faith in God. Then his life turned around and he was tested in another way. Great blessings and prosperity, control of all of Egypt. He didn't try to get back at the people that hurt him. He knew, and he says later on when he sees his brothers, he knew that God had put him there. He knew that all this was by God's hand. And he was not going to go outside of what he knew was right. So those of us who face times of trial and test, we need to remember Joseph. When you are tested with perhaps great power and wealth, remember Joseph. And when you're not sure what purpose God has for the trials that you may face, for the adversities you have in your life, remember our patriarch Joseph. He's one of the few patriarchs, if you think about it, that never had anything negative recorded about him. Think about that. 20 so chapters of the Bible, and we don't see a negative thing written about Joseph. So study the life of Joseph. I hope this has encouraged you to look at him more closely and consider how he can help us in our daily lives.